Good morning, St. Joan of Arc. My name is John Sullivan, and I'm a member of the Parish Speaker Committee. And on behalf of the pastors and the rest of us here, we want to welcome you here, wherever you are on your journey. Today we're really privileged to hear the prophetic voice of Father Jim Martin. We are, however, going to be hearing from Father Martin through the marvels of modern technology. Father Martin will share his message with us via a video that was recorded earlier this week. Then after this Mass, beginning at 1 o'clock, we're going to host a live Skype conversation with Father Martin here in the gym, where there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions, and it'll be a little bit more interactive, so we encourage you to come back. I only ask that everyone please exit the gym after this Mass, including those of you who are going to stay for this session. We want to be able to set up and do a quick tech rehearsal, so before we get the Skype piece going, so we'd ask that you go back out to the Welcome Center and stay there until we'll open the doors at 12:45. If you want to leave your coats on your chairs, that's fine, but we want to have the gym quiet so we can get the tech set up done. Now, I have the honor of meeting Father Martin through a couple of events with my alma mater, the University of Notre Dame. And when I spoke with Father Martin in New York City last fall, I invited him to share his message with this great community. He graciously accepted, noting that he doesn't travel, and thus our unique arrangements for today. Now, Father Martin began his career in finance working at General Electric. Now, he recognized that the corporate world wasn't really his calling, and he began his studies to become a Jesuit priest and became ordained in 1999. Now, Father Martin is the editor-at-large of the Jesuit magazine America and is an internationally acclaimed author of many books, including perhaps his most frequently discussed book, this one, Building a Bridge, How the Catholic Church and the LGBT community can enter into a relationship of respect, compassion, and sensitivity. He was moved to become more involved in the LGBT community and their issues following the 2016 shooting at the gay bar Pulse in Orlando, where he was urging more Catholic leaders to offer support to the LGBT community. By the way, Father Martin's book will be available for purchase in the Welcome Center after Mass. And this one, Julie asked me to throw in one more fun fact about Father Martin. So he served as the religious advisor for the film The Irishman. And he's featured in the movie as a priest performing baptisms. If you're watching the Oscars tonight, Father Martin's actually up for an Academy Award as part of that cast. But last week, Father Martin brought his message of how the church can better minister to LGBT Catholics to about 400 Catholic college and university presidents and other school officials. But as we've also experienced here, his speaking frequently draws crowds of protesters who view his message of welcome and inclusion for the LGBT community as being too radical. Although that message of welcome may seem obvious to those of us who are part of the St. Joan of Arc community, that is not a universally accepted position. But the good news is that there's one important leader who is willing to listen. On October 1st of last year, Father Martin had a one-on-one meeting with Pope Francis to discuss his message of welcome. So now to share more about his message with us, please turn your attention to the screen to hear from Father Martin.
Hi, I'm Father Jim Martin. I'm a Jesuit priest and editor-at-large at America Media here in New York, and I'm really happy to have been invited to speak to you at Joan of Arc Parish. St. Joan of Arc Parish. She's a big favorite of mine. I'm going to be speaking on radical welcome in the Catholic Church. Now, a little bit about my background. As I said, I'm a Jesuit priest. I've been a Jesuit for 30 years. I've been ordained for 20 years, and I've worked here at America Media for 20 years. As a Jesuit, in my formation or in my training, I worked with all sorts of people who felt like they were on the margins. The very first group of people I worked with were a group of seriously sick and ill people in a hospital in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I did my Jesuit novitiate, the first 2 years of Jesuit training in Massachusetts and Boston. I worked with homeless men and women in Boston. I worked for a couple of months with Mother Teresa's sisters in Kingston, Jamaica, with the sick and the dying, also a group of people who really feel excluded, really feel kind of unwelcome in society. In my philosophy studies at Loyola University in Chicago, I worked with street gang members, and then I also worked with more homeless men and women. probably the most sustained and ongoing experience I had with people who feel really marginalized and excluded was the next 2 years when I worked with the Jesuit Refugee Service, JRS, in Nairobi, Kenya. I was sent to work in Nairobi, Kenya with refugees who had come into Nairobi, which is the capital of Kenya, from all over East Africa. And if you know anything about African geography, I didn't, you know that Kenya is surrounded by all sorts of countries that had been war-torn in the 90s. So Somalia, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, all sorts of places where there were a lot of refugees. They came into Kenya and then they moved into the capital. They're called urban refugees. And what we did was to help these refugees start small businesses to help support themselves and their families. They are among the most excluded people in the world today. I think there's something like 60 million refugees, and certainly we in the United States know of the challenges of migrants, you know, who are trying to just look for a better life for their families, you know, coming from south of the border. And then throughout my Jesuit training and my theology that continued, I worked with prisoners, inmates in a Boston jail. Since, I guess, 1998, 1999, when I was ordained, I've worked at America Magazine. I've written a lot about radical welcome in the church and the need for us to go out and bring people in. Recently, in the past couple of years, since I wrote a book called Building a Bridge, I've worked with LGBT Catholics, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, sometimes they say queer Catholics, probably the most marginalized group of people in the church, right? So there are marginalized people in society like refugees and migrants, and there are marginalized people in our church. All of this for me flows from the gospel, and it flows from meditation on Jesus, who himself is always welcoming people. And very briefly, 3 quick stories about the way that Jesus treats people on the margins. So the first one is the story of the Roman centurion. I'm sure you all remember the story of Jesus in Capernaum. A Roman centurion comes up to him and says, Lord, my servant is sick. And Jesus says, I will come and heal him. And the centurion says, Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only say the word and he will be healed. Interestingly, this Roman centurion is an outsider. He's not Jewish. He's not a monotheist. He probably carries around little household gods, right? He's completely outside of the Jewish milieu at the time, right? How does Jesus treat this outsider, right? He listens to him, he encounters him, and he says, I will come to your house. In response, of course, as I said, the centurion says, no need for you to come to my house. I'm a man with people under my authority too. I say, come to one slave. He comes, go to another person, and he goes, do this, and it is done. And Jesus says, in nowhere in Galilee have I seen faith like this. And then he heals the man's servant. So what's the point? The point is that Jesus doesn't say, oh, you're not a Jew, I'm not going to come to your house, or become a Jew and maybe I'll think of coming to your house, or you're an outsider. No, he listens to the person. He encounters him, he treats him with dignity, and then he does a great favor for him. On top of that, he praises the man's faith as greater than in all of Galilee, which includes all the disciples. So it's an early indication of how Jesus treats people on the outside. The second story is the story of the woman at the well in the Gospel of John. As you know, the woman at the well, or the Samaritan woman, is there at the well in the heat of the day at 12 o'clock. Why is that? It's a little interesting tidbit that the Gospel gives us, mainly because scholars say that she was probably embarrassed and had to come in the heat of the day, right? The other women would have come in the cool of the day, maybe in the morning or in the evening, but she's embarrassed because she's been married several times and seems to be married again. Jesus meets her. There's 2 reasons Scripture scholars say that Jesus should not be meeting her. First, she's a Samaritan. She's from a hated religious group, right? The Samaritans and the Jews didn't really get along. Second, she's a woman, right? So Jesus should not be talking to her. But what does he do to this person who is also on the margins, you know, away from Jewish society and away from even her own society, right, within Samaritan society? Again, he listens to her. He talks with her. He has one of the longest conversations in the New Testament with the woman at the well. Very long conversation. And then he reveals to her who he is, the Messiah. He says, I am the living water. You know, she's looking for water. And then she leaves her jug behind and he commissions her to go off as a disciple to preach the good news. Interestingly, a lot of people say that she's kind of an analog to Peter, right? I mean, Peter leaves his nets behind and follows Jesus. She leaves her water jug behind. So that's the second example of how Jesus treats people on the margins, right? Really listening to them and bringing them into the community. Finally, the story of Zacchaeus, and I love this story. Zacchaeus is the tax collector, the chief tax collector in Jericho, right? And that would have been seen as the chief sinner of his time. So Jesus is going through Jericho, and Zacchaeus, who is described as short in stature, can't see Jesus because of the crowd. And one question I like to ask crowds about LGBT people and people on the margins is, when is the crowd getting in between the person who has little stature, right, in our society or in our church, and God? So Zacchaeus climbs the tree, and as you all know from the story, Jesus is passing through. He sees Zacchaeus and says, "Hurry down, I must come to your house." So it's a public sign of welcome. Zacchaeus comes down. He has a kind of conversion experience and says, "I will repay anyone I have defrauded 4 times over, and I will give half my money to the poor." And he comes down joyfully, even though people in the crowd, says the gospel, started to grumble, right? Because extending mercy to people on the margins, extending welcome to people on the margins, always makes some people angry. But Zacchaeus stands his ground, and Jesus says, "Today salvation has come to this house." All right. So those 3 stories, the Roman centurion, the woman at the well, and the story of Zacchaeus, show us Jesus' radical welcome. He is, in fact, critiqued for that throughout the Gospels. He eats with tax collectors and sinners. He does what's called, by New Testament scholars, table fellowship. You know, he dines with them, which maybe today doesn't have the same resonances, but back then was seen as very threatening. So Jesus is always calling us to welcome people, radical welcome, even in the face of, as in the story of Zacchaeus, grumbling on the part of some Christians, right? So I think for parishes and churches today, parishes like St. Joan of Arc, parishes all over the world, we really have to think about who is being excluded in our society, who is being excluded in our church, and we need to mirror, just like Jesus did, this sense of God's radical welcome. So I just want to encourage you to do that, and I look forward to speaking with you later on. Keep me in your prayers, and God bless all of you at St. Joan of Arc Parish.